let's talk about reverb approaches with Dolby Atmos. I get a lot of questions about this. I'm going to talk about how I'm doing this right now in 2023. I have a feeling some of this is going to change for me in the next, 6 months to a year, but this is how I've been doing things. I'm going to play some examples here. So those examples are all going to be in binaural. So you're going to need to have headphones on to listen to any of these. If you want to hear things in full context with some of the philosophies and approaches that I'm using, I have samples on my website that are in binaural. They're full mixes. www.staglproductions.com. You can go and check those out. There are also stereo mixes up there that use the same kind of philosophy. Like my philosophy on reverb is no different in the Atmos world than it is in stereo. I can just do more in Atmos. So you want to hear stuff, you can go up there. In particular, if you want to hear a stereo mix, there is a version of a song called Goodness of God that is up on my website, and I'll put a link to it actually, maybe in the comments. This was a song, when the mix came out, I got a lot of comments from other people about they really like the depth in it. So that might be a better one if you want to hear just kind of philosophy, general reverb approaches. You can check that out and listen to it. First up, let's just talk about some philosophical things with reverb and just some general stuff about how reverb works. And I mean, if anything, this is probably going to be more useful to you in the end than all of the technical, how am I accomplishing things in Atmos. My philosophy with reverb for Atmos, again, same as with stereo. I kind of like reverb to be more felt than heard. I like using reverb for the most part to where you wouldn't know it was there unless I turned it off. Now, sometimes I do make things wetter and I like the big stuff every once in a while, but in general, I kind of want that sort of dry but not dry, if that makes any sense, thing. I just want it to feel natural. I want it to feel like it's in the context of the song and the performance. So, that might mean doing something really long and heavy and layering stuff in there. But I think it's a thing where, if you're not an engineer, you're not listening to it going, wow, that's a lot of reverb. It just fits the context of the song and it just feels right. Engineers might listen to it and go, wow, that's a lot of reverb. And that's okay with me. That's not who I'm mixing for, really. So that's sort of my general philosophy on reverb. I know other people, they like doing all kinds of things with bright reverb and stuff. Most of mine, they tend to be dark. Every once in a while, I will play around with that. So that's going to play into a lot of how I'm using reverb. Now, when it comes to reverb, there's really kind of two reasons I'm going to put it on something in a mix. The first reason is to make something feel like it is in some sort of a space. And that's probably the main way I'm using it. But the other way I'm going to use it is to kind of make it feel like something is further away. I hate using that word depth. I think the word depth is this way misunderstood, misused idea in mixing. People throw this around when they're talking about 25 different things all the time. To me, if I'm talking about depth, I'm thinking front to back. Like, is there this kind of three-dimensionality to it? And in stereo, it's really hard to get that in general. I mean, there's some ways we can fake it, but this is part of why I like the Atmos side of things, because with Atmos, there is, I think, more of that word I will not say. You can get more of that kind of feeling of space and that things are, not everything is like right here. There's depth. I hate that, guys. I'm sorry. I use the word. I hate that word. It's overused. Anyways, I digress. Now, when it comes to reverbs and the way they actually work towards our perception of things, I feel like when the reverb originates from the same position in the mix as the source, it tends to make that source start to feel a little further away. There's some ways we can cheat this a little bit by using pre-delay. We can add more pre-delay, and that will make the source kind of start coming a little more towards us and separating it from that reverb. In general, though, if the reverb originates from the same place, it tends to make things feel further away. And our perception of distance with sound, it's a little more complicated than just reverb. I mean, there's a frequency component to it as things are further away from us. The air absorbs high frequencies, so that kind of stuff starts to roll off. The other thing that starts to happen is as a source moves further away from us, we are going to hear more of the reflections relative to the direct sound of that source. So when we are faking this in a mix context, having that reverb come up from the same place, to me, it makes it feel like it goes a little further away. Now, when we have the reverb originating from a different position in space relative to our source, to me, that's when that source starts to feel like it is more in a space and not necessarily further away. It all kind of goes a little hand in hand in general, but when I want more of one thing than the other, these are things I might play with. So you can just take that little nugget and file it away, and you can tip me and thank me later on if you like, but that is gold I probably should not have told you. So let's look at Atmos and Atmos reverbs. Before we dig in on this, I've just got a rough mix up. Let me just play you a bit of this. I'm probably not going to play any vocals today because copyright stuff gets goofy. If you want to hear vocals with some of these approaches that I will talk about, you can go to my website. There are Atmos samples up there. As I mentioned, you can listen in binaural and headphones and check the stuff out. Here's the link again. But let's just listen to this a little bit, just a snippet of this. All right, so there we go. There's a whole bunch of effects on there. In fact, I'll play a little bit and then I'll kill the effects. So effects are in. So like I said, there felt more than heard. Some of the stuff is fairly subtle in this case, since we're dealing with, mainly drums and a little bit of the instruments. So let me just pull up the drums soloed and you can just hear what the effects are on these. It's going to be way more wet than it needs to be because we don't have the context of a mix, but to hear what's going on, maybe that'll be helpful. So what do I have going on the drums? I have a surround reverb, and for those, I'm just using, today I've got the Symphony 3D, and these are the exponential audio reverbs, which sound good. I don't use a lot of the surround reverbs because while they sound really good, what they do in the mix isn't necessarily what I want them to do. But sometimes they help to kind of give everything a space. And just in general, I'll push these a little bit. I'll mute all the other reverbs and I'll just push the surround one so you can hear kind of what that does. So what it's actually doing for me in the context of the mix, I keep that pretty subtle in general. And I really rely more on the reverbs I've been using for years. I just kind of move them around the room. And I keep the shorter stuff towards the front and then the longer stuff more towards the back. Something you'll notice on these reverb returns, there are a number of different reverb plugins. I change reverbs up all the time because I just get bored, I think, with different reverbs. One thing that is a little different for me now working in Atmos is I am a little pickier with reverbs just based on how much DSP they use. I think when I upgrade my machine, hopefully in the next year or so, that's going to disappear. And there are some reverbs that I have stopped using that I really love. Like I really love the Waves H reverb. I actually have some presets in that. I haven't been using that as much though, simply because it uses a lot of DSP, but that's one of my favorite reverbs. Getting back to these, you can kind of see in general, things are panned in different places. So, the only thing I really added when I went to Atmos was I added this reverb that is specifically in the rear. I always had like my short guy, which I would call a plate here, but it's really just a short reverb. I think right now it actually is a plate. I'm using the super plate from Sound Toys. But I always had that, and then I had a longer reverb, which is this medium, which can get pretty long. I don't know, what is it set at right now? So about 2 seconds right now. So not as long. Most of what I've done though for years is I just would use those two. Biggest difference is I pull the medium one, I pull it more into the room a little bit. And I'll unmute those two and play the drums so that you can hear what those are doing. I'll just play you the medium reverb, which is on the sides, so you can kind of hear that. Versus here's just the plate up front. I'm really just blending all of this stuff together until it feels good and it kind of feels like it's around. And, so I might start with just the kit plate and the medium and get that feeling good. And then I might add in the surround one to sort of add it to feel a little bit more like it's everywhere. And then if I still feel like it needs something more in the rear, I'll bring up the rear. So let's just, here. I'll just start adding these in that way. So we'll start with the two. If I just turn on that rear one. So this is pretty short. Yeah, it's really just kind of like a chamber room, just something to put in the back to make it feel like there's something there. And it's the kind of thing that when everything gets going, it's going to disappear. Because again, especially with drums, I don't want it to feel like, wow, drum reverb. I'm just trying to augment the drums with the reverb. Anyways, that's how I'm doing the drums. Feels good in here. I like it. I'm not trying to make this like, wow, with reverb. This is just how I'm handling it, and it kind of works. Let's look at the vocal side of things. When it comes to reverbs in sessions, something that hasn't really changed for me with Atmos is I just like having a lot of options ready to go. Just things are there. I can just push them up to where things feel right, and it hasn't changed for me with Atmos. The things that changed, like I added a quad reverb for vocals that's up top. It's just a dedicated send. So if I can put some stuff up in the ceiling a little bit, that feels good. But the rest of these, it's similar to the drums thing. I've got the shorter stuff. I usually keep that towards the front. And then I have the longer ones kind of usually more towards the sides and towards the back. One thing I do with this sometimes, and there's a couple of different approaches, and I didn't come up with these. Most of the ways I've been handling this are the same ways I've seen a lot of the big Atmos mixers out there, the way they're doing stuff. I mean, a lot of the stuff I grabbed from how Steve Genowick, how I saw him doing things, and I adapted some things a little bit, but I didn't invent most of this stuff. One of the things that I do with reverbs sometimes is I have what I call my cascades. So these are my backwards cascades. And basically, it's just different delays on things. So there's a 64th note for, where's that going? The sides. The top rear one is an 8th note. So what these do is basically I will have a reverb that sends to this kind of network of delays, and the delays are all different. So as you send something into that reverb, the reverb kind of it's like having a different set of pre-delays all through the room, so that the reverb kind of does this. Something that helps when you're doing this kind of thing, if you want anything to sound more spacious, you have to figure out ways to sort of decorrelate the version in one speaker from the version that is in another. And delaying things helps like this. If those delays all sound a little different, like anything you can do to make things sound slightly different as they are showing up in multiple speakers, it will make those things more apparent. I don't know how else to explain it, but in general, we want different things in different speakers, not the same thing in multiple speakers. That doesn't give us this sense of everything. We want to get the sense of it all being crazy and around us and like we're in this thing. We need different sounds in different places. And this is one way to kind of fan reverbs backwards. Now, the way a lot of guys do this is they don't do it with the delays. The main reason why I started doing this with delays like this was because if I have all of my reverbs, like multiple versions of them, like to get them all over the place, it's going to take a lot of DSP up on my machine. And to cut that down right now, it saves resources, basically. It's resource management. What a lot of other guys will do, though, is they'll take that first reverb and they'll kind of duplicate it and then make slight alterations in each of those reverbs and either change the pre-delay times in them, maybe slightly change the lengths, just whatever you can do to make it a little different, and then sort of fan it all towards the back and different. And that gives you this sense of, if something's up front and it hits the reverb kind of goes like that. It feels cool. You can do this kind of stuff with delays too. I know I have in my delays with the delays, my 8th note delay, I actually do that with the delays. So I've got my 8th note up front, and then I have one that hits the sides, and I have one that hits the rear. So these are all being fed kind of in order. So the front delay feeds the sides feed the rear. So it goes backwards. You could set it up to do stuff in the other direction too if you wanted. I mean, there's so much you can do from a creativity standpoint and different ways of doing that. The one thing that I think is a challenge with all of this, aside from DSP use, the biggest thing is just the time it takes to kind of set these up and build them in the first place. Some of that takes time. It's not the kind of thing that I like to build when I'm in the process of mixing. So I have a lot of this stuff kind of built into my template to begin with, and then I might move some things around here and there. For example, like I have a quarter note delay in here right now. It's panned basically to the front wide position, so it's going to be a little bit more kind of out to the left and right and then back in a little bit. Maybe I might want to put that in the sides, or I might want to move it into the ceiling, or, who knows where I want to put it. But sometimes I will move that stuff around within the mix. But in general, this is kind of how I have things set up in here. Another thing I have set up, this was something that I got from an engineer when I was up in Nashville earlier this year. If you do the kind of split harmonizer thing where you have, basically we're doing a pitch shift on one side and a pitch shift on the other, like up a little bit on the left, down a little on the right, or vice versa. It's a classic harmonizer trick. I've used it for a long time. Well, one of the things you can do with this now that I got when I was up in Nashville from Mills, I'm sorry, I can't think of his name, but I totally stole this from him. I have one version of that is on the sides, and then the other one is in the back and in the rear. Sometimes that feels cool. I'll just kind of push things that way. So that's the vocal reverbs. Again, if you want to hear this stuff in action, samples on my website, but that's kind of how I've been handling reverbs, and it's been working. I do have set up in here with my short vocal. I do have a way to duplicate that reverb, to do the multiple reverbs front to back. It's just when I start using heavy DSP intensive reverbs, my machine starts crying and screaming at me. So I don't do that. But this brings up a good point I should mention right here. For these reverbs, I am mixing basically songs from scratch with this reverb setup. Every music project that has been coming into my studio starting in 2023, I mix it in Atmos from the start, from the beginning. That's why I have to be a little picky with DSP. When I'm doing a mix for somebody into Atmos, the stereo mix is already done. I'm using stems. That's when I might start using more of these kind of multiple reverbs and things like that, because I'm not putting EQ and compression on individual channels as much, because a lot of that has already been done and it's baked into the stems. Now, sometimes I still have to do it for things, but in general, it's a little different. I have a little more flexibility in terms of how my DSP for my machine is getting used. So that's why sometimes I am making compromises, or I don't know if compromise is probably the right word. But that's why I am choosing to do one thing over the other. I never feel like I'm sacrificing quality in a mix to do something like that, because if that becomes an issue, I will figure out a way to make the other way happen. There are all kinds of other workarounds we can do these days with track freeze and committing things, and I am not afraid to use those kinds of tools if it means I can have 3 more reverbs in a project, because I've already got so many of them in there to begin with. Why wouldn't I want to add more? I mean, I am kind of a junkie with reverbs. There's a lot in there. But you can just see in this particular mix I have up, not everything is up. It's just whatever I feel like I need at the time. Something I will mention in here, though, in terms of surround reverbs, I do have a couple of surround ones. These are just 7.0 reverbs that I have dedicated for background vocals. Something I like doing, and there were some gospel tracks that I was getting sent this year where I feel like I was getting, it was a lot of backgrounds. And it was the kind of thing where once upon a time I might have frowned on all of the backgrounds coming in and that they hadn't all just been printed already down to a stem for me. Now, though, it's cool because I can take them and I can fly them around the room, which I want to do. But to get the reverb to work properly with those kind of moves on the source, that's where I feel like having one of these surround reverbs comes in handy more often. If I've got 24 tracks of background vocals and I have put them all around the room and up into the ceiling, when I put reverb on them, I don't want the reverb to all just originate at the front. I need the reverb to originate properly with that background vocal. And going back to my whole philosophy of how I'm using things, those are circumstances where I don't mind pushing it back normally because it's a background vocal and I'm trying to get separation a lot of the time between the lead vocal and the background. And when you start putting background vocals all around, they do compete in a different way with a single lead, or maybe a single lead that has a couple of doubles on it. It's a little different in the context of the whole mix and how it's all going to feel in the room. So, short story, basically, that's why I have some of these dedicated background vocal verbs and their surround verbs. And, there's a short and a long, and I will play them to taste like everything. So I also have some reverbs in my sessions that are set up that I can just use on other instruments. Again, not really a new thing for me, and there's just more stereo reverbs, and they are throughout the room. I also have a quad reverb in the ceiling that I can send things to. In my heart, I kind of want to do away with some of this stuff in time. I really want to get back to working where I have a smaller number of reverbs and I can kind of put everything into those different reverbs. It's more of a classic kind of approach to reverb. The reason I ended up with all of this stuff split out was just the need for stems that has grown over the years and people wanting stems. It gets a lot harder to print them when you're doubling lots of things up into different reverbs. And I ride reverb levels a lot when I'm mixing. So that's another place where, I like having separate reverbs for the drums and for the vocals and things like that. But I kind of want to simplify sometimes. But in the meantime, I just have all of these other reverbs there. So I hope that helps explain some reverb stuff for you, maybe gives you some ideas of things to try. And honestly, you just have to play with things. Just start throwing stuff around the room with reverbs and see what feels good. What do you like? I mean, that's basically what I've been doing. I took some ideas from some people and then I would just put things up in here, and if it didn't feel quite right, it felt like it needed something else, I'll put a reverb on and I might play with where it is in the room. And that's kind of how I landed on where things are set right now. But, this is an ongoing, evolving kind of thing. I'm going to change this up over time. I have no doubt. And I think as more Atmos dedicated reverbs start showing up, I will probably start transitioning a little bit into more of those especially if they start doing the things I want them to do. Right now, though, I just don't feel like the panning flexibility works the way I want it to get things to sound the way I want them to in different parts of the room. So until that happens, I'm just going to keep doing this. And I have so many different reverbs that are stereo available. I mean, I don't want to stop using those. I like them. That's just my approach. So again, if you missed it, if you want to hear full samples, you can go to my website and hear them. If you are trying to get some help with a mix or there's a question or something, please feel free, leave a comment. You can contact me at one of my websites below. If you need a mix in Atmos, I would love to help you out with that. You don't have to go through the trouble of setting all this stuff up. You could just send it to me and I'll mix it for you. Links are below. Thanks for watching. If there's other stuff you want to know about Atmos, other things you think I should talk about, please leave a comment in the description. I'm always looking for ideas on that. And I will talk to you soon.